All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, both in person and if you are online, thank you for joining us online. And my name is Brooke Medina. I'm the Vice President of Communications here at the John Locke Foundation. And we have got a great lineup for you today. It is commandeered by Ray Notstein, and he's going to be discussing the limits of politics, as I know anyone who is here is probably championing as well, especially as we see the growth of government, and we just wonder when they're ever going to stop. But they seem to want to infect every area of our lives. So Ray is going to discuss that today. But before he does, and before he comes up, I just wanted to let you all know of a few different items. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the State Superintendent, Catherine Truitt, joining us, as well as one of her colleagues, Dr. Jenny Korn, and they're going to be discussing learning loss, which we know is certainly a problem, despite some people wanting to pretend otherwise. And so we will be talking about the latest research that they've done for North Carolina children and quantifying what sort of learning loss we are facing and what our kids are facing. Also, I wanted to let you guys know we have a pile of Parents' Bill of Rights one-pagers. So these are from the John Locke Foundation. We know that in the news there has been a proposed Parents' Bill of Rights in the Senate. And so this is a little bit different. And so we wanted to give you all the opportunity to check out what we have proposed and the advances to school choice that we recommend in our Parents' Bill of Rights. So please feel free to take one of those on your way out. I also wanted to mention just some of the lock items that we have. If you're interested, I'm really excited about these. These seem to be very popular. It's the lock socks. So if you want to constantly be reminded of the philosophical prowess of John Locke, our namesake, please feel free to go check out the lock socks back there. And then we have some other lock merchandise, such as our lock t-shirt, very, very colorful John Locke. Our attempt is to make John Locke cool again among the youth as well as others, but I hope you'll check that out. So I'm going to move along and move out of the way momentarily, but I'm going to introduce our speaker to you. Ray Notstein is the opinion editor at Carolina Journal and a research fellow on the Second Amendment issues at the John Locke Foundation. He previously served for over 7 years as managing editor of Religion and Liberty, a publication of the Acton Institute, an internationally top-ranked think tank in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His writings have appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, Detroit News, Charlotte Observer, and many others. He has extensive experience in radio and lecturing on public policy and cultural issues, including over a decade of writing and research work on the Second Amendment. So if you want any of the best Second Amendment takes, go to Ray, check out his work at carolinajournal.com. He is a graduate with a Master of Divinity degree from Asbury Theological Seminary, and he also holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from the University of Mississippi. He currently lives in Garner with his wife and soon-to-be 3 sons. So with that, I will pass it over to Ray.
Well, thank you for being here. I know you guys could be doing something fun and productive today, but you chose to be here, and that means a lot to me.
This will be fun.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. It's totally going to be fun. I do want to say, just real briefly, I want to say something about DDay. It's the 78th anniversary, and I think it's an opportunity to be proud of America. We should always be proud of this country, and I think if we doubt our credentials as a nation, then we'll be headed down a very scary path, probably scarier than the one we are now. And I know many of you have been to Europe, and one of the things that just overwhelms you is when you go into those cemeteries, those American cemeteries in Europe, just the whole kind of scene overwhelms you. And we liberated that continent twice, and I think it's just days like today are days to be proud to be an American. And that FDR line comes to me: the prayers of liberty loving people go with you. The remarks that he made about the invasion. And I think that's something that should just always characterize who we are as a people, to be liberty-loving people. And I think importantly to understand our history, because if we don't understand our history, if we don't embrace our history, then I think we'll struggle as a nation, we'll flounder. And D-Day is just one of those days of many where we can be so proud to be Americans. So I hope, I think I'm speaking more to people outside of this room than probably in this room, to just don't doubt our credentials as Americans. My first memory of the news or politics when I was a kid, I was 5 years old in kindergarten, the 1984 presidential election. I'm so old, there's probably nobody else in this room that remembers that. But Mrs. Booth's class in suburban Philadelphia, my dad was an Air Force pilot, so he's stationed over in Saudi Arabia for a year. We're living closer to my mom's parents in suburban Philly. And Mrs. Booth, I always just these vivid memories from childhood. It was on a circular, colorful carpet with lots of numbers, lots of letters. And Mrs. Booth rolls in, because she had one of those roll-away boards. I don't know if they still have those. I'm sure they do. But she asked everybody in the class, this is probably about a week before the election, who are your parents voting for? And we went around each kid. And it was something, this is a pretty scientific poll, because I usually lived on a military base, but this is the suburbs. 21 students for Reagan, 5 for Mondale. And I remember thinking as a kid, man, I kind of felt sorry for Mondale a little bit. I didn't like him because my dad was in the military. I was Team Reagan. But I kind of felt sorry for Mondale a little bit. So it's one of those vivid memories. And I actually don't remember Reagan and Mondale from that election. I remember bits and pieces on the TV of Jesse Jackson because he had a historic campaign for the Democratic nomination. And I remember Gary Hart because I thought he would have problems 4 years later. You can Google that if you don't know what I'm talking about, but most of you do. But I remember Gary Hart because he had the last name Hart. I think he must be a super compassionate dude. He must be really nice. And I do remember John Glenn. John Glenn was a famous astronaut, and I remember maybe picking up pieces of something my parents said or grandparents. And so I thought, well, it'd be cool to have an astronaut as president. But I was definitely for Reagan. And I tell you that anecdote to plant a seed, right? I'm planting a seed about my interest in politics and my interest in campaigns. And then I'm not going to go through my whole childhood. There's some cool stuff, but I'm going to jump forward about 10 or 11 years. And I'm living in Mississippi, just moved back from Egypt to Mississippi. And I remember starting paying attention to politics even more. I was reading a lot of stuff over in Egypt, but I was back in the thick of things, or so I thought. So I watched the 94 election returns. A lot of you remember that. And it was kind of the first time I noticed anchors on the news melting down over an election. And so that was a big kind of event in my life. But I'll tell you what was even bigger. About a year or two later, I picked up a book called Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms. Has anybody ever heard of this book? Raise your hand if you've even heard of it. Okay, raise your hand if you've heard of the name Ed Rollins. Ed Rollins, yeah. Yeah, a lot of people here have heard of Ed Rollins. He ran Reagan's 1984 presidential election campaign. Very plugged in. I think he worked with Trump for a while. But I read Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms, and I was mesmerized, absolutely enthralled by the book. He tells stories about working with Michael Huffington out in California, which at that time was the most expensive Senate race campaign of all time. Michael Huffington was married to Ariana Huffington. He was gay. He didn't actually like politics. He didn't like women. And he was running for office. But he had no interest in politics. It was his wife that pushed him into it. So he tells crazy stories from that campaign. Then he runs Christine Todd Whitman's gubernatorial, very historic campaign in New Jersey, 1994, tells crazy stories. The craziest stories of all are from his time with the Ross Perot campaign, and he talks about Perot's paranoia. So I was enthralled again, planting a seed. And then, about a year or two later, I discovered an even crazier book. It's called, and I know a lot of you people have heard of this name, Bad Boy, The Life and Politics of Lee Atwater. Anybody familiar have heard of that book? You know who Lee Atwater is if you don't know the book. I encourage you to read the book, though, because it's even crazier than Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms. Atwater, he was famous, of course, for driving up negatives of his opponents, right? So one funny story from the book, and you probably heard it before, but Tom Turnipseed, who was a state senator in South Carolina, and Atwater was working with Floyd Spence, who I think had recently switched from being a Democrat to a Republican, and like a lot of what was happening in the South in the 80s. But anyways, he's running against, He's managing a campaign against Turnip Seed, and Turnip Seed had been very open in his life about undergoing electroshock therapy as a youngster. And Atwater makes a comment, and it reverberates across the state. He goes, you know, old Tom Turnip Seed, he was hooked up to jumper cables. And so this was all over the wire in South Carolina. It ended Turnip Seed's career, completely kind of ended it. Atwater, of course, would die of brain cancer, sadly. You saw what he did to Dukakis, and I think fairly. A lot of people look at that race, but I mean, Dukakis was a Northeastern liberal, and he carved him up pretty good. But anyways, he apologized to Turnip Seed, and Turnip Seed ended up going to his funeral as he was dying from brain cancer. But also, even crazier book, still living in Mississippi, by the way. Anybody heard of this book, The Last Hayride? The Last Hayride is primarily, I can't remember the author's name, he was a journalist, but The Last Hayride is primarily about the late governor, he just passed away, I think last year, Edwin Edwards of Louisiana. Anybody heard of, raise your hand if you heard of Edwin Edwards. Yeah, very famous politician. I think he was a 4-term governor at different times in Louisiana. And this book completely captivated. Edwards would say things like, he was called the Luca Brasi of the Bayou, the Silver Tongue. He was called Fast Eddie. He went to federal prison for a while, racketeering, all this stuff. But he would say things like, I don't like to kiss the babies, I like to kiss the babies' mamas. He would say things like, what else did Edwin Edwards say? Really funny guy. He would go, I mean, his razor sharp wit was great. He goes, he was running against David Treen in 1984 in Louisiana, and he goes, the only way I'll lose this election is if I get caught in bed with a dead woman or a live boy. And then, running against David Duke, I think this is about 1992, David Duke was a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Running against David Duke, Edwin Edwards says, the only thing I have in common with David Duke is we're both wizards under the sheets. So all that to plant a seed, right?
And you went to divinity school?
Yeah, heck yeah. I haven't got there yet. And there's some substance. It's not all just stories, but so all that to plant a seed. I had this deep interest in politics. When I was in high school, my hero was a campaign manager for a congressional campaign I worked on. And he just sat in his office, Dip Skull or Copenhagen. He had bottles of dip just surrounded him everywhere. You know, he always had his feet up on the desk, always yelling into the phone. For those of you who know who Dallas Woodhouse, he was like, kind of like Dallas. But this guy was my hero, right? And, that tells you how, kind of tells you where I was. And I was such a dork, I would walk around school with a copy of the Washington Times. I'd get it mailed to me and read all the columnists and stuff. But the point was, like I was very, very, like a lot of you and like a lot of folks, just very interested in politics. Thought I had a lot of answers to things. Thought I could solve a lot of problems. And so I went up to seminary. I got a call to ministry when I was at Ole Miss, really just reading through the Gospel of John and studying the civil rights movement. Andrew Young had a big influence on me. His book, Uneasy Burdens, another book I would recommend reading. But when I was up there, I'm starting to think a little bit more about telos and what's our ultimate purpose, what's our relationship to the Creator. And I started noticing something in politics, and maybe it's just where I am. Obviously politics has always been distorted, and there's always been issues with politics, but I'm going to call this BW and AW. This is kind of an important two-point prong that I'm making. BW, before Wellstone and after Wellstone. This is 2002, midterm elections. I think this is when you see kind of a change in our politics, a little bit of a shift, a catatonic shift in the urgency and fervency we see in politics. Of course, Wellstone dies in a plane crash, former U.S. Senator from Minnesota, about a week before the midterm elections. And his memorial rally turns into this raucous, political, chaotic event, right? Rick Kahn is one of his friends, and he's the one that really starts kicking it off, saying if we don't elect Paul Wellstone, it's going to ruin our lives. It's going to ruin our hope. He started calling for all these things like minimum wage laws and all these federal initiatives. We have to avenge his death, basically, is what he's saying. And I think also true, which is kind of like discouraging kind of watching this, because I watched some of it, the rally, is it was a largely secular service, and it was basically saying that, you know, the only thing that gives death meaning is politics, which I thought was a bizarre kind of way to look at things. And people like Trent Lott, who showed up to say goodbye to his friend, were booed, the Senate Majority Leader from Mississippi. Dick Cheney was the sitting vice president who was not allowed to attend. And if you kind of just, at the time, it was a really kind of big shift in our political nature. If you look at it now, it wouldn't be a big deal, right? I mean, when Donald Rumsfeld dies, people get on Twitter and say, rest in piss, or F Donald Rumsfeld, or they get on, you know, another figure dies. People kind of just say, this is what they mean. You know, it's all from a political materialist perspective. But I think it's a key turning point in our politics. I saw like the bitterness and nastiness beginning ratcheting up after that funeral. And of course, I think George Bush's presidency didn't help that, right? I mean, kind of an unpopular president at times, didn't do a good job of communicating to the media. So now we celebrate the deaths of figures on social media. And I just want to point out kind of, you know, it's not just obviously Democrats. You can point to just here in North Carolina, right? The Trump attendee at a rally that punched a protester in the 2016 election. Certainly the chaotic events of January 6th. One only needs to look to recent Supreme Court nominations, midterms elections. I mean, one of the things I always think is funny is people in California or Oregon or Washington melting down about races in North Carolina or Georgia. I went to Nashville during the height of the pandemic, and I was flying back from Nashville. This was during the Ossoff. I can't remember if he's a U.S. Senator now from Georgia, but this is when he was running for House. I think his name's John Ossoff. And I know you can't get through security unless you're flying, but I remember going to the gate. You know, I was flying from Nashville to Raleigh, and there was right next to it was Nashville to Atlanta. And there were people at the gate holding up John Ossoff for House signs. I just thought that was so bizarre that there was no space that wasn't politicized anymore. And so I think that Wellstone funeral is kind of one pivotal key moment. We're going to look at another kind of messianic moment. When I was in Washington, or when I was working at the Acton Institute, Obama came and spoke right outside our headquarters. It was in the Quad. And I just remember seeing the young people's faces glazed over, right? I mean, I went out and watched Obama speak because I thought, well, this is late in the campaign. He's certainly going to be our next president. I wanted to go see him. And I was just fascinated. And you saw clips of this on the media, or you saw clips of this on social media at the time, but just faces like glazed over about what he was saying. So I do want to just quickly point to a couple of video clips that I think explain a little bit what I'm talking about. You may have forgotten these, but there's like 40 of them online.
We can change the world. Na, 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 na. Na, 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 na. We can change the world.
I would like to see a cleaner earth for my child that I'm bringing into the world very soon.
Yo sí creo que este país puede ser.
I think it's time for change. I want a better future for my children.
Obama.
I would like our environment to be safe.
Necesitamos respetar nuestro planeta.
Este es nuestro América. Mi América. Tu América.
This is our America.
Mi América.
My America.
Tu América.
Your America.
La América de nosotros.
Oh, Obama, Obama,
Obama, Obama.
Someone to actually make a difference in my generation.
Obama, 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 Obama.
I would like to see us in a world without fear.
Basically, I just want the war to end. I would like the rest of the world to think highly of our amazing country.
I think the thing that inspires me most about Barack Obama is that he really is going to be the president of the United States. You know, he's not going to be the president of the top 10% or the president of the most powerful corporations or the president of the most powerful lobbyist. He's going to be our president. He's going to speak for us because we put him there.
Obama. That's what Obama's about. Unity to this country and changing America's face to the world.
This one, little catchier. I like it a little bit more.
Roots come Kenya.
I have a dream. I have a dream that one day this great nation, all the voters in America, Barack Obama be thy name. Thy change shall come, thy will be done, as it is in American dream. We sing again, all the voters on America, Obama be thy name. Thy change shall come, thy will be done, as it is in American dream. It is Obama for the White House, all the way from Illinois, Washington, D.C., open your doors for Barack Obama, for a change in America. It is a change in Africa, Australia, Asia, Europe, South America. Barack Obama, it is Obama in Florida, all the way to Chicago, New York City, Hollywood, New Jersey, Texas. Barack Obama, from California to New Mexico, New Orleans.
Yeah, listen to this. This is from the 2008 campaign. Very memorable campaign, by the way. I'm just going to read some figures. You'll know, I think, all of these names, if not every one of them, or most of them, if not every one of them. Ezra Klein, good writer, of the Washington Post said, Obama is not the Word made flesh, but the triumph of the Word over flesh. It's from a column. At a campaign rally in, I believe it's Columbia, South Carolina, Oprah Winfrey said of Obama, he is the one. She then added, we don't need politicians who tell us the truth, but we need politicians who embody the truth. Not to be outdone, Chris Matthews, formerly of MSNBC, he's got some good books, if he writes them, maybe he does. He says that Obama comes along, he seems to have the answers. This is the New Testament. By the way, of course, Matthews was nicknamed Tingles by a lot of folks on the right because he said Obama gave him a thrill up his leg, whatever that meant. I don't know what that means, but you all. But Jamie Foxx, great actor, excellent actor. Anybody who's seen that biopic of one of my favorite artists, Ray Charles, excellent actor. He just says, unironically, I might add, Obama is our Lord and Savior. Obama said of himself and of his campaign, this is in Denver, 2008, I believe it's his Democratic nomination speech, as if he's akin to some kind of creating force over the universe. He says, this was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. So what's going on? I mean, before we look at kind of what's going on, let's just look at kind of what politics are for, just at a base level. At the American founding, politics is linked to the purpose of government, which is securing property and promoting the common good. John Locke himself said government is to secure life, liberty, and property. Jefferson, of course, transforms this to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which means the right to human flourishing. Not necessarily as Cartman from South Park would say, you know, I do what I want. For those of you who have seen South Park, you might lose your salvation if you watch it, but Cartman, he goes around going, I do what I want, right? No, that's not really what the pursuit of happiness means. It means that pursuing kind of a right-ordered liberty and pursuing a virtuous society, we need those for self-government. We know a lot about rights today, but we don't talk about responsibility. The truth is our most famous and recognizable American creed posits a religious statement that all men are created equal and we are endowed by our Creator. It reflects the Christian imprint of the Imago Dei, or the image of God. It implies that we have rights beyond the state and that we have a right to flourish and possess space beyond the state. So in the political sphere, we are supposed to be masters, right? Not servants of the government. When this becomes inverted, we become hostages and serfs to ideologies and power for the sake of power. Politics is more effectual, and particularly policy, when it's limited to its sphere under the framework of our federal and state constitutions. The great thing about the Constitution is the goals aren't to limit the people, but to place specific limits on government. It doesn't speak to politics or ideology, but it speaks to limits and checks on and balances of power. As Madison notes, the essence of government is power, and power lodged that it must be in human hands will ever be liable to abuse. And I think the principles of federalism are so important today. Our 10th Amendment that's on life support remind us that government closest to us represent us best. As John Randolph of Roanoke, the former, from a long, long way back, former Virginia senator said, "No government extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific can be fit to govern me or those whom I represent." Randolph goes on to say that government, to be safe and free, must have a common interest with those that they do represent. So I think it's important, and this is obvious, and I think everybody in this room agrees, but we must put politics in its proper place and context for the political sphere to flourish. And we must give credit to the essential roles of policy organizations like the John Locke Foundation and other like-minded groups, because it's calling us back to basic first principles, right? And I think that's essential today, is that we're called back to first principles. One of my favorite addresses, and you should read it if you haven't read it, but it's probably the best speech from the 20th century, Calvin Coolidge's 150th anniversary on the Declaration of Independence. And in this speech, I think it's important because it gives us a purpose of politics, but it gives us a purpose for America as well. He goes through and basically gives a defense of the free society, but Coolidge also takes a shot at the progressives, at the rise of Marxist-Leninism. You have to understand, I think, to fully grasp the speech, what's going on in society in the world today. You have the rise of Marxist-Leninism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You have progressives in Europe and lots of new immigrants coming into the U.S. And Coolidge says that while you amend and change the Constitution, the founding ideals, they're final in society. They're final principles. And it's actually the progressives who are regressive. Progressives are the ones that are being regressive in their worldview, because you can't advance past the basic founding principles. And I think that's important to understand today, kind of where we are. So let's kind of look, where's the disorder and how are we disordered today? Because we're certainly, I think, living through a lot of it now. I mean, you see it through parts of the Obama campaign, some of the worship of Trump by some of the antics on the right and the left in politics today. But as a former colleague has pointed out, and really many others, ideologues, they're most consumed with the question about who is going to win the election, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's their most base concern. Who is going to win? Because if they can be concerned about politics and get you wrapped up in that, they can diminish civil society. The things that are supposed to be a buffer between the state and politics. The arts, things like religion, institutions, they should all be subservient to the political sphere. But that's becoming inverted today. So winning for them, people who have a Marxist or materialist worldview, and you could be a libertarian and have a materialist worldview. I guess you could, I think it'd be hard to be conservative and have a materialist worldview. But certainly the statists, many of them today have materialist worldviews. And what that means is they want to control, diminish any realm outside of politics. They want to coalesce power. They want to reduce man to a politicized automaton, to diminish the soul and the spirit. If there is no transcendent truth, then brute power and ideology takes over at the expense of others' rights or even lives. When politics is not limited, we see what happens today. We are constantly at each other's throats, fighting on social media. People are banging on the doors of the Supreme Court building because they're upset about nominees. They're upset about people breaking down over people being appointed to the court. When I was a child in the 80s, the Supreme Court nominees wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a huge thing, and now it's become a life and death matter. So as long as we make politics the highest meaning, we will ultimately lose the battle for ideas and a healthy, vibrant, flourishing society. It was Chesterton who noted, whenever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they will worship the world. But above all, they will worship the strongest things in the world, which today means politics. And as Tocqueville noted, one of my favorite writers and philosophers, how is it possible that society should escape destruction if the moral tie is not strengthened in proportion as the political tie is relaxed? So I think those are kind of pivotal points that need to be made today. And it's incumbent upon all of us to kind of take a step back and not worship the political sphere. I think the cable news industry, the 24-hour news cycle, I haven't watched cable news in years, but I think that feeds a lot of our fears and destruction today because, you watch cable news, or if I'm on Twitter half the day, or if I'm doing this half the day, I'll go out and say, people are really crazy. This country's messed up to the core. I mean, it's fragmenting, fracturing. But if I go out and meet and talk to daily people, they're like normal. And a lot of them think like I do. And I think I'm going to briefly say, kind of like out of order a little bit, but what I think solution-wise, one of the things you can do is be friends with people who don't agree with you politically. I think this is an important point. I've got a few friends that don't agree with me politically. Sometimes I want to elbow them a little bit. But I think it's important in a healthy society because that shows that you limit politics, right? So I'm going to go back. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I worked for Congressman Gene Taylor for a year out of college before going to seminary. And I think he had some helpful kind of lessons that I learned from that experience, and just him in general, about putting politics in its place. So when I was working with Congressman Gene Taylor, went up to Washington for a time, super excited. I get up there, and this is not an indictment of Gene Taylor. He's a really good guy, but I noticed some conflict going on. I see a lot of shameful things happening in Washington, D.C. in general. There's kind of a cloud around D.C. I almost call it a little bit of spiritual cloud. And I'm up there. Things are not going necessarily the way I want them to go. At this time, I kind of want to be a political consultant. Even though I was getting called to seminary, I was fighting. I was maybe there's an opening to be a political consultant or something. And up there, working, had some conflict with somebody in the office. I remember being really upset at that time. And my best friend, he was a former Air Force navigator. He was 11 years older than me. So I didn't really have that many friends either. And it's kind of like Harry Truman said that, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog, right? He says, go out and get a dog. It's a famous quip from Truman. But I remember just having a really bad day. And I used to give Capitol tours part of the time I was up there because I knew a lot about history. And, most people didn't know all the dorky stuff about what's inside the Capitol. But I hadn't really noticed before. I was walking through Statutory Hall, and I think I was just almost visibly upset where I was moved to tears. And I'm walking through Statutory Hall, and I saw a picture of Father Damien. Who knows who Father Damien is? So Father Damien, he was a Catholic priest who ministered to the lepers of Molokai. And he's one of the two. Does anybody know who represents North Carolina in Statutory Hall? There's two representatives from each state. Zebulon Vance is one of them. I think it's Aycock, might be the other. But anyways, there's two representatives from each state in Statutory Hall. So I lived in Hawaii before. I lived there for 3.5 years. And I was really upset that day, really frustrated with a lot of things going on in Washington, a lot of things maybe going on in my life. And I saw that statue of Father Damien. And it just kind of overcame me a little bit because of what he did. He gave his life. He was the opposite of today's social distancer. He would wrap and bandage the wounds of the lepers. He would bathe them. He would clothe them. He would sleep next to them. He would comfort them. And so I saw this picture of Father Damien, and it just had a profound effect on me in that moment, and thinking, man, I mean, look, and I'm not discouraging anybody from public service or running for Congress or anything like that, but it just kind of imprinted in my mind that there are servants that contrast other servants. And it was an important reminder about the political sphere and how we need to make sure that that's subservient to the greater things in our life. And Gene Taylor, when I worked for him, he was elusive sometimes. He would disappear in the Capitol, and I had to find him one day. The Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, was in his office for 40 minutes. You're not supposed to keep the Secretary of the Navy waiting. And so everybody's upset at each other in the office. And I'm getting yelled at because I'm new. And they're out, go out and find Gene Taylor. It's on you to find him. Secretary of the Navy is upset. He's been in the office for 40 minutes. So I'm walking through the Capitol, running around, trying to find Gene Taylor, going to all the places where he might be, the basement, the gym. And finally, I hear his voice in the stairwell. And I go up to Gene Taylor. I was like, Secretary of the Navy's waiting for you. It's been 40 minutes. Maybe by then it's been an hour and stuff. And it's like, everybody's really upset. You need to get back up there. And he just kind of looked at me. He's talking to a maintenance man. He said, okay, I'll be up there. And then, I'm waiting there, freaking out because I know I'm going to get yelled at. And then finally he comes out. He's like, all right, let's go. So we're walking, and he's like walking like this. And I'm like, everybody is going to be so mad at me. And then I don't know if he said it then or he said it later, but turned out to be prophetic. But Gene goes, my best friends here are the Capitol Police and the maintenance workers. And I'm starting to understand there's going to be a moral lesson here. But he goes, because those are the people that will still be friends with me when I lose. And, I think that kind of moment had a profound effect on me. So it reinforced some important lessons, and it planted a seed. Politics is a reminder of what John Kenneth Galbraith said when he noted that political hope is the most disorienting of drugs. Look at the people today. I mean, we saw the 2 Obama campaigns. There's plenty of Republicans we could poke fun of. But look at the people who put their hope in politicians, whether it be, DeSantis, whether it be Trump on the right. But it's up to us, I think, to go out and make friends with people we disagree with, to cultivate a culture where we would be worthy of self-government. I think that's, if you don't remember anything of this speech, from the speech today, I think remember that. We have to, if we really want to be a nation and country of self-government, we have to cultivate that culture ourselves, and it starts with us. And I think that's really an important point, because if we're not cultivating self-government, if we're not being responsible citizens, if we're not being civic educators, then someone's going to step in and tear apart that space, and they're going to take power. And it's not going to be the kind of people we want taking power. So I think that's really essential. Politics can solve some issues, but if the people are virtuous, it really is upon us to note that politics doesn't solve the human conditions. It's permanently ongoing and never was expected to settle definitive answers about justice or human destiny. It can't right most wrongs or even bring order to our inner lives. And I think that's also an essential point. One of the things that's funny in our society, and you see this on the news, whether it be cable news or people write columns about this, like, how do you handle the Thanksgiving Day dinner with people that you disagree with, right? To me, this always seems so silly, because I don't understand the people that are talking about politics at Thanksgiving. That seems so bizarre and surreal to me, but I think there are a lot of people, maybe particularly on the left, who get so, fixated on politics that it overpowers even Thanksgiving. So again, solutions, understanding there are more important things in life, being friends with people that you don't agree with. I think being a civic educator is key, going out and telling people about the John Locke Foundation, telling people about the ideas of self-government, why self-government is important, not just for winning elections, not just for racking up a tally sheet or a scorecard in November, but it's important because we're supposed to have space beyond the state. And then, I was kind of like writing some of this out, and one speech I went back to and looked, I didn't know if it would have anything from the address, but it's a really good speech. I remember it from my childhood. I remember when Ronald Reagan went to Moscow, because it was a historic thing in 1988. It was towards the end of his presidency, obviously. And I found a good line from his speech, and I think it kind of helps us bring this talk to a close. Reagan said in his speech, this is what he's telling to Moscow students. This is at Moscow State University before the collapse of the Soviet Union. He says, democracy is less of a system of government than it is a system to keep government limited, unintrusive, a system of constraints to keep politics and government secondary to the important things in life, the true sources of value found only in faith, family and faith. And I don't know, has anybody read The City of God by Augustine? So you've heard of The City of God. It's a famous book by Augustine, and he makes the point, it's one of the overarching themes of the book, but he says that, there's people that worship Rome. There's people that are obsessed with the Roman state, but they don't know about the city of God and what it compares to Rome. The heavenly city is of no comparison. And Augustine basically says Rome was never great. Rome will never be great, but it's the heavenly city. So I think that's an important reminder, again, of putting limits on politics and putting politics in its place. And as Jesus, the Christ, notes in John's Gospel, I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. Thank you. Absolutely, yeah. So if anybody has any questions, I will try to answer. There are some things I'm not an expert on, but I will try to answer the best to my ability.
What I got out of your presentation was how we should approach politics, and I guess to keep our sanity. But if you do a contrast of the Obama campaign and the Trump campaign, Obama gave us no substance. He gave us hope and belief.
Yeah, right.
Trump hit different things. He talked about dollar and cent issues and tariffs and things that people could connect to in one way, and Obama, how people can connect to another way. So you got two very diverse approaches to the population, and both were successful. And I think the problem we have now is trying to grasp what are the professionals going to do to manipulate us to believe them? Because it's constantly changing. You know, you look at any issue, and one party looks at one thing, and the other party looks at another thing, and they're bombarding us with information. And I don't know if that's a question, but it's just a curious way that we're being persuaded to one way or another.
Yeah, the question relates to how the professional class, how do we believe them, or how do we have faith and trust in them, and maybe a little bit on the differences between the Trump and Obama campaign. I think that was one of the brilliance, at least at that moment. I don't think it would work quite as well today, but one of the brilliance of the Obama campaign, it was kind of in this vacuum, that there was no specifics. I mean, you saw that through the videos. It was all about making the earth clean, it was ending the war, but nothing about how to do that. And of course, what was fascinating about Obama is because of this kind of messianism, political messianism that surrounded it, people were able to take whatever hopes, dreams, and aspirations they had. I think the video made that clear, and project that onto Obama, right? And that wasn't really unfair to Obama, although he encouraged it and people around him encouraged it. But ultimately, that wasn't fair to his presidency in many respects, because no president can save you from yourself. No president can deliver you from your personal problems or your angst. So for the professional class, I think one of the things, and maybe I probably should have dived more into this, but I think the loss of faith in institutions is pretty critical today. So really, there's no deep admiration or deep faith, I think, in maybe the professional class today. And there's some good that comes from that. There's some bad. I mean, we see skepticism. Sometimes the government tells us the truth and we're skeptical because sometimes they don't tell us the truth. And you see this, whether it be vaccines, and I know there's different sides of vaccines, but you can have other issues where people, I think, flounder about what the government tells us, and I think for good reason, right? I mean, one of the reasons that black communities were skeptical of vaccines, which wasn't presented in the media before, was because of the way that they treated some black citizens and African Americans with the syphilis medications, and that they sterilized actual human beings in our country, right? So you saw all of this like skepticism, and the media didn't ever really want to broach that to a deep level. Some did, but most didn't. So that's a really hard question, because I think a lot of this is on the government. A lot of people, whether it be on the right or the left, they're really mad about Trump. But to me, Trump was just a phenomenon of our failed institutions, our failed political class, the failed Republican Party in many respects, especially in Congress, probably less so at the state level, but no ability to control spending. And of course, Trump didn't do anything about that either. But I think Trump is just sort of this vessel of all the failures of our institutions, of governing bodies in America today. And one of the things, you like Trump or you hate Trump is, and I was surprised by this because I thought he'd kind of pivot to a Rockefeller Republican, but he generally governed as a pretty mainstream conservative outside of a couple issues. And I did not see that coming. I thought he would kind of pivot more to the center and be what he was historically, which was a man kind of without a party and without fixed principles. And it's kind of fascinating to see Trump, and whatever he goes from here. It's, to me, the one thing he does get credit for is, for a lot of stuff he said, he actually did, or at least he tried to do if he couldn't do it. So to me, that was a kind of fascinating in politics, because Biden, I mean, he says one thing and does something entirely different.
One thing I'm more interested in is not so much how any person presents themselves to us, is our reliance on the media to give us a fair understanding of all these people, and we don't.
Right.
One network will do X, another network will do Y. We were talking earlier today, you know, us older guys, when we were growing up, we were 5, 10 years old, we never talked politics.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it's consuming us.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. That's a really good point. What's your name? Anthony, that's an excellent point because, you know, I remember one time, I guess I was in high school, and I was over at my pastor's house, and he had some other, like, semi-prominent theologians over, and they were talking theology, and I was like, this is so boring, man. Theology? And so I was like, why don't we talk some politics? And they're like, politics? That's stupid. That's boring, you know? So, but I think people had this view, especially, you know, the sophisticated weren't the people that talked about politics. Now we think of the sophisticated people in our society and culture, the people that are on the news, right? I mean, those are the people that are on cable news. Are so sophisticated because they're talking about politics. But when you, in the 40s and 50s, the sophisticated people were talking about art. They were talking about the theater. They were talking about books, the great books, right? I mean, we grew up, you know, you guys grew up in a time when almost every household, middle-class household in America had the great books in their house. And, you know, people were talking about stuff like that, or they're talking about the Yankees or the Dodgers. But now, I mean, politics is consuming everything. And I think that's so, I think that's just a bad way for us to go, because the more, you know, I don't know if I made this point well enough, but the more we politicize things, the more things become centralized in the state, right? I mean, the more we politicize, the more things get, we rely on Washington to solve things. The more we look to Washington. It's funny to me that we look to Washington for so many issues, especially on like gun control or Second Amendment. Like Washington seems like the last place you would want to look because they're over $30 trillion in debt. The inflation that we have today is all because of Washington and the overspending. There's no like sane monetary policy. They're wiping away savings for Americans. You're not going to be able to retire if you're young because of what they're doing to our currency. So anybody looking to Washington to solve anything, I think, is completely ridiculous. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a little bit more about Lee Atwater? Was he responsible for that ad with the crumpled up pink slip in the Helms Gantt election?
I don't think he was, but I could be wrong. I don't know enough about Lee Atwater and his work in North Carolina. That was 1984, right? Harvey Gantt.
South Carolinian.
You're right. I don't know. I don't think so. You know, what Lee Atwater's mostly known for is the famous Willie Horton ads in Massachusetts. You know, about Willie Horton was a convicted murderer in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts had furloughs where you could actually leave for the weekend if you were a felon. And when he was, and this is not just Willie Horton, but other people did this. They would get furloughed, and then they would go kill somebody, and then they go back to prison. This happened, or they would just be on the loose. And so Willie Horton was that famous ad that, and I think it was controversial because there was a revolving door of inmates. And one of the inmates was African American, and some people said he looked like Willie Horton. Of course, Willie Horton was used, his mugshot or something was used in the ad. But, you know, I always thought, to me, that was a fair game because, look, I mean, Dukakis was soft on crime, and Atwater was able to isolate that and put that out in the campaign, and it was very, very effective. People can argue about, was there racial tactics with the ad? I don't know. I mean, certainly I think it probably appealed to some people that lean that way, but I mean, I think it was a fair ad overall. I don't know about the Harvey Gantt. I mean, I know what ad you're talking about, the famous crumpled up paper about affirmative action. I know that ad. I don't think Lee Atwater was involved with that, but I could be completely wrong because he would have been involved in a lot of stuff back then.
You mentioned the possibility that because we're so consumed with politics, that tends to feed the centralizing of powers in the state. But I wonder if it doesn't work the other way as well. The more the state becomes all-powerful, we've all got to become interested in politics because it's got the tentacles into everything.
No, that's a good point too, and I think we're all susceptible to that, and and I don't mean that we shouldn't obviously go vote or be involved in campaigns. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just we have to put politics in its proper place. But you're right. I mean, we have to pay attention more because, right, the state becomes even more encroaching. You know, their taxes go up. We have to plan for that. We have to plan for woke prosecutors, right? We have to go out and maybe think about arming ourselves because of woke prosecutors in urban environments. So the more the state encroaches, the more it's incumbent upon us to be involved in various ways, and we get sucked into it. And I think that's the danger, right? I mean, ultimately, I think we need cultural change. We need a cultural transformation, because I think there are elements on the left and on the right today that are so consumed by politics that, I think we're either going to potentially fragment at some point as a nation, or, we're just going to consume ourselves with just insanity. And I don't know what the long-term trajectory of just political insanity is. I mean, I think it just means, space for kind of soft totalitarianism to creep in.
I have a question. So there was a recent Echelon Insight survey. They're a pollster at the national level, and I was reading their results, and I found that those who are around 35 and younger are much more likely to only have friends that are affiliated with the same political party as them. And so obviously, because it was a little bit more taboo to talk about religion and politics in company, a few decades ago. Nowadays, people talk about it all the time. So what advice would you give to young adults who are looking to implement the solutions that you recommended, where we're not making politics all consuming? Like, practically speaking, if you were talking to a 25-year-old North Carolinian who is conservative, how would you guide them on progressive friends?
Yeah, I think the basic way to do that is just to read a lot. I mean, read different authors, read different works. I think familiar yourself with, I think be passionate. If you're passionate about politics, that's good. You're passionate about campaigns, because they're still exciting to me. I mean, they're enthralling and stuff. But I think to also be passionate about the systems of government, reading about people like John Locke, reading about Jefferson, reading about American history, I think is important to, because a lot of the things we're seeing today has happened before. I mean, there's been messianism in politics before, the Cross of Gold speech, William Jennings Bryan. There's been, none of this stuff is inherently new. I think some of the outbursts because of social media and cable news, make it more polarizing, and we're more aware of it in some respects. But I think the best advice I could give is just read and know about our history, know about America, learn about our history, learn that there's been big disagreements. We had a civil war at one time. I mean, people killed each other in this country, and they lined up and charged at each other. To me, that's, we're nowhere near that, and hopefully we'll never go in any of that direction again. But, I think it's important to contextualize history. And, that's, to me, has always been an important trait in transcendent truth in my life, is you have to contextualize history. I'm a Gen Xer, so it's still weird to me that you would pick friends solely based on politics, or pick even, hang out with family members. You see these things on Twitter about someone saying that my grandmother's dying, but she's a Republican, and so that's good. I mean, people say this. It's like, I'm not going to her deathbed because she voted for Trump, or vice versa, or whatever. I mean, people say this stuff, and then, they get all the likes and retweets, and they think that they sound good, I guess, but to me, that's so bizarre and shameful and crazy. And I don't understand how, maybe because I'm Gen X, that people don't get offended about disagreements. That helps a little bit. I don't know, but it's just bizarre to me. Like, I never get offended if someone disagrees with me. That's totally fine. Unless it's my kids.
This is a topic, but it goes back to your background, going to the seminary and the divinity school. What I sense is secularism of everything.
Oh, yeah. Big problem.
It took ownership in Europe.
Yep.
It's taking ownership here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any of the religious, including the Catholic Church, doing anything to combat it. It looks like the Catholic Church may be leaning more toward, I'll call it the non-traditional behavior patterns and desires of the left.
Yep.
Rather than stand fast for their traditional beliefs.
Yeah, so the questions about the role of church in society, and the role of faith and secularism, and how it's creating more statism, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, look, I think there's a big problem with this in the church today. I think that I wrote a piece at the Acton Institute you can find online. It's related to the limit of politics, but I think the church missed, not that they had to be against government COVID protocols, that wasn't my point, but I think that they missed an opportunity to talk about the dangers of state control, the dangers, MLK, Martin Luther King called the church the conscience of the state. But if it's not, if we're not being the conscience of the state, and we're just ceding to the state and letting them do what they want, then that creates a vacuum where the state just takes more and more power. And when society's secularized, the power becomes the state. And we see that with a lot of young people, right? They don't have any faith in God, or they don't believe in God. So the state becomes all powerful, and they believe that every election is the most important. Every event in society, they break down and freak out about an election that they don't, in a state they don't even live in. And I think that creates, because ultimately, it's kind of like with the Wellstone funeral, is death becomes, only becomes political. And so that's what you see on social media, is like, we indict people now by their politics with their death. And that, to me, that's so bizarre that we would say they're a bad person because of their politics when they died. Like, I don't know, that's really weird to me. But again, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.